Our presenter today is Jonathan Henner. He was from the University, so sorry. So sorry. Oh, so our presenter today is from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He is a professor in the Department of Education and a successful researcher in many different areas. He is in language development, assessment, and he is working on comparative linguistics, and also recently started researching accessibility and equity. And that is what he's going to be presenting about today. His main focus now is language justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Henner.
Okay, seems like we're ready to get started. I just want to make sure everyone is able to see my PowerPoint slides. Zoom always complains that it wants me to unmute myself, but obviously that's not something I need to be concerned with. The title of today's presentation is, Are There Broken Languages or Broken People? We have 4 sections to cover in my presentation today. First, we will talk a little bit about who I am and why you should pay attention to me. We'll talk about where it came from, where I got my start. We will take a look at the beginning of Crip linguists and how we've come to claim it, and then where we go from here. Not many people know that I actually do not have a PhD. I have an EDD. I don't say that often because people tend to look down on an EDD, but that is in fact the degree that I hold. The reason that I did not have an affinity to go into academia is because when I graduated college, I actually went straight to work. I worked in the corporate field for several years. I transitioned to becoming a scholar, and I started working in this field later. Of course, when I transitioned into academia, they asked for 3 letters of recommendation to be able to get into my master's program. And by the time I was in the last class I had taken, it was several years ago. So I just asked some random people from my past if they would write a letter of recommendation for me. It seems like they forgot who I was because they wrote poor letters of recommendation. And my mentor told me that because of that, I was not able to actually enter the PhD program. However, there was an EDD program option where they would accept 2 letters of recommendation, and so I was accepted to that. You see here on my slide that I am listed as second and third author on several articles. I have worked for several years as a scholar. I have worked with kids. I have dealt with work through the pandemic. And because of that, to be able to maintain publishing, sometimes it is better to support people who are primary in the field so that I do not take on the role of first authorship. Certainly, there is a hierarchy of who has the structure of writing. And certainly there are instances in that hierarchy where some people can be considered first author, 2 people can be considered first author, but that's not often a battle I tend to fight. We will discuss 3 main research goals today. First is how we assess signed languages. That has long been considered in my work. Second, we will look at the impacts of linguistics, education, and disabilities studies on the approaches of language. We will look at those all through the centered lens of disability. It is important to consider how privilege plays into the work that we do. I had a strange experience yesterday. I was teaching class and I was explaining about the documentation sound of Sound of Fury, a documentary, and that was brought up in class. People tend to use people's or deaf people's perspective on cochlear implants in common dialogue. But the movie that was being discussed was released 21 years ago. And many of my students are under the impression that that is still a hot topic in the field, when in fact the discourse has changed significantly over the past 20 years. It's not only in this specific context, but also in a broader context that we see a disconnect between discourse that is happening in the greater community and within the deaf community. I began work at Boston University and I started to build a receptive assessment tool for American Sign Language. The person who established it initially was Bob Hoffer, and his long-standing goal since the 1980s was to show that ASL and English are not in conflict with each other. At that time, there was no real ASL assessment. And so how you were able to show that ASL and English were not in conflict with each other was to build that assessment. Children were given English assessments and ASL assessments, and the 2 were compared. That is where I got my start. I had traveled all across the US, and I have conducted assessments on children and their language skills. Today, I still do consulting on statistics and measurements for that assessment tool for sign language. Crip linguists really are kind of a startup profession, and I have learned through my work traveling the country and providing assessments for thousands of kids that there is quite a lot of challenges for those children in the assessments that are available to them. How we analyze, how we got the data that we have in the first place actually came to be suspect to me. And so I decided to do more research into the topic. I will share one of my favorite stories that happened when we were testing vocabulary. And I know the assessment back and forth, of course, because I was the one who developed it, and also because I had given it so many times already. The basic part of the assessment was a stimulus and then 4 options for a response. For this assessment, it was a vocabulary test. So, chocolate cake picture came up, and then 4 options to choose from. The right answer was cupcake. As we were conducting the assessment, a boy came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "The right answer is not listed." So I asked him, "Are you sure?" And he said, "No, I don't see it." And that got me thinking. He said, "Come with me." And so I followed him over and took a look. And I asked him again, "Are you sure the right answer is not there?" And he said, "No." And so I asked him, "What do you think the right answer is?" And he gave me an answer in sign language. And I said, "Okay, well then just make a guess." Sometimes if you ask kids to guess, they will use their intuition and they will find the right answer. But that boy picked an incorrect answer. And that struck me because I know in the data, it would show that that child did not understand the concept of chocolate cake, that he didn't know what it was. But I spoke with him. I chatted with him directly, and he had a very clear concept of what it was. It's just that the sign that he used was not in his 4 choices of vocabulary. So the theory was that deaf kids who use sign language should use meta-linguistic analysis to be able to choose the right answer. And yes, technically, but obviously we can see from the fact of that story that that does not always happen. And I have many stories of similar instances that I could share, but we don't need to digress into that. Throughout the years of thinking and pondering the assessment tools that we have, I have talked with other scholars who have a more comprehensive understanding of the assessment process. One of the first big conversations I had was with Dr. Laurent Park about assessment. And there were 2 big discussions that really struck me, because our school systems demand a list of assessments. And assessments have to be run within that style, which means that we have to be able to test 100 kids or 1,000 kids simultaneously. Really, it's just a math data collection. But when I spoke to him, his response was that that style is actually building pressure that is being put onto the students. And so we need to actually take a look at the whole ethical approach of that assessment. And after that conversation, I was really my gears were shifting. I was thinking it through, because years of assessments given to kids in school, I had no way to think of where I could assess language outside of that context. It was required by the school system. And still, based on my experience, I knew that what we were doing and how we were doing it was wrong. And yet we were continuing to provide this antiquated system of assessment to our children in schools. Sometimes what the system requires is not always right, and yet the system is the system, and there is a level of bureaucracy that leads us down to a place that we can't really get out of. So how do we assess language and not forget how people actually use the language? Many of you are aware that I have had for many years, I've had a good relationship with Dr. Octavian Robinson. And we have done some research and study together. Working with him has helped me to understand that many sign assessments are sign production based. And what that means is that when someone signs, there is someone who is checking off a proverbial list. And there's also high risk assessments for signers, assessments that are needed for licensure or certification. Or even within the school system, there is still a list of things that need to be checked off in order to pass. But with any kind of checklist, we have to recognize the bias that needs to be unpacked. But that is often overlooked for the sake of the system. And so that means that within our field, we are at a high risk within our fields, we have a ridiculously high risk of assessments becoming predicated on sexism and racism and ableism. Because if we think about it, language and the bodies of those users are not separated like those systems would like to think they are. I have worked for special education, and one negative is that there aren't many signers. So often I am the only one who has that theory. I'm the only one who tends to buck up against the system. And I have had to ask for other scholars to help me in my understanding of how to approach this. There have been challenges, and I have certainly struggled. But I feel like oftentimes what I'm doing is just throwing something out into the void, trying to find the best way, when often I get a lot of feedback and criticism online. I don't have any kind of issue with that. Because I'm always looking for new people to help me broaden my understanding and help me understand all of the complexities that I myself bring to the table.
So there are two big philosophical theories that I use as a frame. These theories that I found through online interactions with people in the field. One is ratio linguistics, and the other one is critical disability theory. When I started studying ratiolinguistics, I began my reading and I started reading a lot more about critical disability theory. And I was noting parallels between the two. They're not always symbiotic, but they really work in parallel from different groups of thought. So the ratiolinguistics, we know that language and bodies are not separable. So how we interpret and view language is related with the physical being. Different labels and identities and different philosophies behind those labels. So what's considered good language, what's considered bad language, and who ends up being punished for these things, or who has good language skills or who has bad language skills, or who is subjected to ELL or placed in ELL classrooms for their learning. People who write about critical disability theory say the exact same thing. Within the school system, disability and race are intertwined. It is a perfect circle. We recognize that kids of color are often more removed more often from the classroom. They are hidden. If you go to the trailer that's on the side of the school building, the students that are in that classroom typically are children of color or individuals who have specific labels or more difficult disabilities. The nicer ones are learning in the other class, the regular classroom, but oh, you have a behavioral disability. So obviously the white kids typically have the nicer labels, and the kids of colors are typically the Black kids are more likely to have the oppressive labels. There's a lot of research showing that those oppressive labels are actually self-fulfilling prophecies. They lead to incarceration later on. Not just in special ed, but a lot of researchers have found that the amount of kids that were in special ed that end up incarcerated, it's a direct pipeline. And where does it stop? Where does the child is never able to escape the system. And we know more than half of people who are killed by police have a disability. And again, racism and disabilities are inexorably linked. Ratiolinguistics, I found that there were many more parallels or commonalities in the texts. Several years ago, when I was reading Dr. Rose's book, I noticed, it was very obvious to me, the ableism embedded in their book. The book itself doesn't actually mention this. It makes the assumption. What I assume was ableism, but they assumed it was racism, but I see it as ableism. For example, in the case of Dr. Baez, they spoke with not clear English, and a white colleague assumed that she was stupid. But where does that incompetence, the assumption of incompetence come from? That was embedded in the language that she used as a person. And that's very condescending. They envision that language as being inferior. Both the body and the language were combined, where only a type of person who would use that kind of the only type of person who would use that kind of language would be somebody who was stupid. So now, stupid and language are correlated. When I looked through the book, trying to make some connections, but I don't remember if they had, I was looking through other ratio linguistics publications, and I didn't see that connection anywhere in there. And I realized there has to be something there about how we view disability in the ephemera. So during Dr. Robinson's and my work on crip theory, we kept bumping into what I like to call our traveling theory. A lot of disability activists and disability authors borrow heavily from the Black liberation authors. Any disability rights activist or activism is always found working on the foundation of the Black activism movements. So Section 504, where they placed disabled children in classrooms, actually came from Brown versus Board of Education. The 504 protests and the sit-ins were backed by the Black Panther organization. Disability rights can never be separated from Black rights. Often, there are so many theories that we've borrowed, but they're used by white disabled individuals to create privilege for themselves. And the disability community has never really been clear about how much has been borrowed. Early in our work, we were talking about abled fragility. And we were talking about how when people point out that we're doing something is offensive to the disabled community or a disabled group, the response is typically, oh, well, I'm just trying to help. Or I'm a parent of a disabled child. I have a lot of heart for that group. One story, it was actually a deaf ed researcher who was on a panel. The panel was talking about deaf trauma, specifically sexual abuse. And the panel it was all hearing teachers. There were no representatives from the actual deaf community. And Deaf Hope is a big proponent for trauma and trauma-informed information, and they were very offended. And they were upset. So I went ahead and backed out of that particular panel, but then I saw the same person complaining that it was an all-male panel. And they didn't see the similarities between an all-male panel and an all-abled body panel. So it was very clear to me that those were very similar. But my point of this is that many deaf individuals say that we can't borrow from people of color. And we realize that if we borrow, we're just changing the labels, and that's still borrowing. So crip theory does present an issue in that regard. So we have to accept this traveling theory, and at this point, I don't actually have a good answer for it. It's always something that we're thinking about and something that we're processing. There's no escape from the fact that much of crip linguistics comes from my dialogue with other disabled people. My own experience being a disabled person in this world that we live in. often I'll be asked, what does it mean to be a person in this political work? And sometimes the question is actually, what is a broken person, or what is broken language? Part of our struggle as scholars who study disability and language and history is the perpetual trauma from reading about what is written about ourselves. It is an ongoing experience. What people say about disabled people is dumbfounding sometimes. So in these two paragraphs, there's a famous deaf education researcher who is calling deaf children dumb and saying that they can't understand, which is beyond arrogant. Oh, they don't know what they don't know. Those dumb deaf people. And not only are deaf people dumb, but they're immature too. Really, these are so easy to find. I haven't even talked about what they say about people who have autism. What they say about people with autism is beyond. Sometimes it's worse than what they say about deaf people. When I'm writing about my responding to these things, or when we're bumping into these theories that are out there, I try to be polite. It's okay to talk shit about oppressed people, but it's not okay to talk shit about the people who are writing it. More than one of my recent papers, I wrote about a researcher who looks down and writes as though deaf people and their syntax are both racist and are based on both racist and ableist policies. The author did not like my feedback. So I had to use information from April Baker Bell, where I was like, look, these are the comments that were made. This is why we are criticizing those people. Other things that I've found in my work, if language is attached to disability, then it's okay to try to marginalize or push out that language. And I'm showing this graph now, and it's a comparative assessment between reading comprehension skills and spoken language skills in early elementary and then in late elementary. So it does have 3 groups. There were kids who were in an oral education tradition, so only spoken language. And then they also had students that were learning sign, but only for a brief amount of time. Those were excluded. And then individuals who had been signing for a long time. Now, their definition of signing is atrocious. I don't think there's any type of, I think they're considering any type of gesture to be sign, which is besides the point. But the goal with this particular graph was to try to demonstrate who had the least amount of sign exposure actually spoke better. And I guess the point of this chart, or their goal, was to try to convince a wider audience not to sign with children. Because if children sign, it means that they won't be able to speak well. And I've seen scholars in the field for 30 or 40 years try to convince people that signing and speech and reading are in direct conflict. However, people are not in direct conflict, rather. However, people are stubborn. And so we need to have a revolution for anything that would cause a visual disability. Signing is one of the most visible types of disability out there. And a person who signs has failed at being hearing. It's a failure of the system to support them. In their pure environment, no one has any visible disabilities. No one would be able to sign. There's a lot of discussion about and writing about justification for deaf individuals. And over the last 5 years, it shows that signing can actually support better literacy skills in deaf children. But I don't really give. I don't care about it anymore. My goal at this point, it's no longer to show that signing makes better readers. Because for what reason? If somebody has better literacy skills, it doesn't mean that they're a shining star and a model deaf individual. You can have all the things that academia can give you. The world doesn't run like that. If you're deaf, you're deaf. And you're broken. And it doesn't matter whether or not you have good speech skills or not. But I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm not interested in trying to convince people about the correlation between signing and literacy. Is it so bad to be visibly disabled? Are we at the point where we accept that the goal is to become a pure society? If we can't recognize the white supremacy in that particular construct, then something is missing. Basically, something basic is missing. Because the goal of removing disability is, at the end, a white supremacist goal.
Every time we change interpreters, it asks me if I want to unmute myself. And no, I'm not speaking. I don't need it. One of the things that we have noticed is if a scholar themselves are disabled, then the entirety of their research is often ignored. The only authority that is actually paid attention to is those who are hearing, which is interesting because what actually is happening is in the background: information sharing, networking, attending conferences. All of that is easily accessible, as where disabled scholars are fighting for simple access to be able to show up. Some people will say, oh, but deaf people are too close to it. When I was writing an article with Diane Lorman, I was reviewing a complaint on our non-objectivity. The complaint was that the researcher should be neutral. And I used authority through Diane to push back on that complaint. And eventually they did accept our support of the usage of sign. The question is, who can speak for the deaf? Who can walk for those in a wheelchair? Who is the voice of the voiceless? Ability is still at the core. Parents of disabled children, people who work in the profession with disabled children, teachers will always have more authority than the disabled adults or the people living that experience day in and day out. I briefly talked about this earlier, but we have multiple identities. And when we consider that, things become more complicated. The disability community is very diverse. I am a white deaf man. If I was standing next to a black deaf man, we are not the same. Obviously not. I mean, that's a superficial thing. We can get much deeper into what exists in our different identities. But if we were to be walking down the street, we are already automatically being labeled by those who pass us. And we will not be treated the same. Even if I'm signing, if I walk into a store, I'm not going to be followed in the same way that that other gentleman would. It becomes exponentially worse as more identities are added. Whatever the identity is that is already there, it is doubled by disability, tripled, quadrupled. So that means if I say, oh, for the deaf community, they're all the same. What about the deaf community, the Black deaf community? There is a separation there. Sometimes when white deaf people complain about hearing authority, many deaf of color talk about hearing authority, yes, but you have the same skin color. You are supported in that. There are Black hearing researchers who can look at the Black deaf community and in some ways understand that better than a deaf white individual. There is such nuance in these relationships. And sometimes we put too much emphasis on the periphery, and we don't actually take the time to understand the complexity of this. In general, I think people from the community need to represent their community. Those who are actually living the experience. Gatekeeping is hard enough. It's almost impossible. It's hard enough for people of color in academia who are hearing. It's even harder for those who are deaf. There is such a need for hearing people of color and abled people to support the deaf community and the deaf people of color in that community and lift them up. We can no longer rely only on the white perspective. So if we look at linguistics and we look at ability and speech and we consider that to be paramount, there is no consideration for anything outside of that order. You can go to the LSA homepage for plenty of good examples, and you can see what their definition of linguistics is. If you look at it, it will tell you it's the study of sound. There's no consideration for signing. There's no consideration for tactile signing. There's no consideration for Braille or for ACC, communication through pictures, or gestures. Sound is the only thing mentioned. We have yet to convince them that disability and language are intertwined and that we need to consider a broader spectrum of what language means. That their memes are ableist. Why, as linguists, why are we considering it tongueology? Why are we only focused on spoken language? Why is our view that narrow? I do want to emphasize that as a linguist of sign language, I have experienced one moment for the interpreter. As a sign linguist, I use ELAN, Ellen, and hearing people use Pratt. And I know what Pratt, P-R-A-A-T, is, and yet they don't know mine, ELAN. There is an issue of speech taking priority that has proliferated our society. I'd like to talk a little bit about these two publications. First, the research is that if you speak clearly, you'll feel better about yourself. And secondly, if you speak clearly, then people will like you. If your speech is muddled, people won't like you. These are two published articles, and they were published fairly recently. Again, there's a connection between clear speech and humanity. And obviously, to me, the fact that you can't speak well has no implication on your humanity. You don't need to be fixed to fit into our society better. Obviously, we see white supremacy here. I have already spoken to that. How researchers see disability is sort of in an olfactory way. They don't really have an understanding of what disabled people interact with on a daily basis in the material world. There is an assumption, well, we see a lot of issues with masks, and because their environment and their understanding of the world is inferred, they're not, it's not outside of their body, that they are then dependent on sound. And they assume that all are dependent on sound. And if someone is to receive a cochlear implant, then all of a sudden, as this article states, she heard the siren and it saved her life. I have been deaf for 38 years and I have never been hit by a car. I promise you, I have eyes. I use my eyes. It's not a matter of my ears to save me from that siren. There's a psych book from 2019 that was teaching about how disability is something that we fear. So what does that mean for me, for a person who studies assessment? For a deaf person with multiple disabilities, what does that mean? For someone who is engaging in the world and trying to support other deaf scholars and deaf of color scholars, what do we do with this? Where do we go from here? In my work with Octavian, we have done quite a bit of study on crypt linguistics. And I know that I don't have a lot of time left, maybe 15 minutes or so. And I do want to save some time for questions. So from all that we have discussed so far today, Octavian and I decided to focus on 3 essential truths. That language is not inherently disordered, though impairments may exist. That disability and impairment are indeed different. The idea of impairment really came about because disability studies focused far too much on societal expectations and norms, where disability resulted in no access. People who were in physical pain, people said that they expressed that they did not want to be in pain. In the deaf perspective, if we look at the world through the lens of deaf space and of using a sign language, I am not disabled. If I am in a fully deaf environment, I have full access. And remember, access and disability are linked. It all depends on context. Some will say, oh, disability is bad. That any language used by a person who has a disability is automatically broken or impaired. There is a lot of responsibility on crypt linguists to look at the normative expectations of language. A lot of people don't seem to understand that if we look at a bell curve, if we look at those who are on the outskirts of that, just because they exist on that end of the spectrum does not mean that they're any less important. We must consider the environment. If you want to take a Black individual and you look at them on a normative expectation curve within society, and then look at them within the context of their own community, we will see them in different places. Blackness then becomes a defect if a white teacher perceives it as something that needs to be fixed. They are then labeled and assessed and often penalized for that. There is a researcher who has explained her work in regards to the school to prison pipeline. And I must consider, if I were myself disabled and a person of color, I am considered impaired and non-normative. All of these things must come into play as we progress with this work.
I think one of the biggest frustrations or roadblocks that people seem to have is, how is it possible that language can't just be broken? We have SLIs, and we have kids that need to be involved with support and language learning, need more support with their language learning. But if we go back to what acceptable variation is in language, how we accept their variation, or some people view that variation as bad. If the variation is from a disabled body, people automatically think that the variation will be bad and must be fixed. And that's why we have speech disorders and language disorders and reading disorders. Our school system is founded on disorders. I want to make it very clear that I am not attacking those people's work. I do respect Dr. Cohen's work, but it also shows that the language can be descriptive. The part that makes me uncomfortable is that you have established something as normative, and therefore you must have a non-normative. So if you set in art that language is normal or normative, and people who don't adhere to that are not normal, this article is related to kids who have autism, but they could not follow the normal expectation, and so therefore they were broken. They couldn't follow the art instructions in order. We need to stop. Why must they be non-normal? Our pursuit of normality, is that really what we need? We have non-normal as well. That's variation. Why do we have variation? There's been a lot of work on normativity and the bell curve and figuring out where people fall on this bell curve. So the standard deviation is designed to remove any kind of outliers or any kind of variability. Multiplication has purpose, it has intention, but we need to look and apply it to a variety, to the different areas within the bell curve. We are trying to order people and organize people, but people are within the structure of this curve. It's very odd that we've established where the bulk of people are just normal or just mediocre, and we're just like whatever with that. But then if you are brilliant, amazingly gifted, you're at one end of the spectrum. And it doesn't matter how the person got to that point, how they became gifted. There's a lot of things that a lot of giftedness actually emphasizes whiteness and elevates specific kinds of individuals, like white, rich individuals that have resources to be successful on assessments. But the broken people need to be included as well. But if we adhere to this particular normativity, we must have broken people in order to set up a bell curve. We don't function unless we have this foundation of people who need to be involved or included. If you help people enough, when there's no longer any brokenness, most people do well. So we're starting to wonder if we are strict enough. Have we designed a system to oppress individuals who are broken or who are impaired? Jesse Stommel has a theory about ungrading. And our work at the community university we work with minorities and majorities. They don't have typical backgrounds. So for them, we apply this theory to them, Dr. Strommel's theory, and her grading started to look like that bell curve. So she was summoned, and they forced her back into what was considered the normal distribution of grading. They were concerned about rigor of her courses. Other people wanted to take her classes more than the other teachers. So academia forced her to use the brokenness system. And there's always some kind of foundation that is oppressing disabled individuals. They were concerned about rigor, but really what they were doing was oppressive. Our obsession with normativity means that there is no longer any way to support dialogue or support if I don't understand the way you want me to understand, then I'm broken. Or if there's an accent that I don't understand, you're broken. Or if I don't understand something about your race, you're broken. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. It must be my way, period. I've done a lot of work recently with Pragmatics. I have this basic idea of normativity that what we see is in good conversation depends on the assumptions and the ability to make assumptions or inference. A lot of that is based on indexicality. Now, my background, I have no social linguistics training. One challenge I've had is that everything is supposed to flow together. So I was reading one article, and I kept going back to that article again and again, and the author assumed that we all had this common knowledge, and I struggled to comprehend that particular article. I ended up one evening with Silverstein. I was just like, I'm going to bed. But one thing that I've started to recognize is this assumption of passivity, where we don't really understand how disabled individuals are continuing to adapt their language. And so we are interpreting that as overly impaired or overly broken. Deaf people want to pass. Oral deaf people want to pass. Autistic people want to pass, to mask themselves. It is constant work to adhere to the pragmatic laws. And if we violate one pragmatic rule, we are instantly labeled as immature if we are deaf. Or autistic people don't have any empathy. And so we have to strictly adhere to these pragmatic rules. But those aspects of this don't show up in the literature. Again, it's a fundamental belief that the listener has all of the power and that the right of the listener is sacrosanct. So a good dialogue requires that the speaker be perfect. And that's where speech therapy comes in, and all of those things make their appearances known. Because I'm not perfect for the listener. Therefore, where is there within the disability community, there's this emphasis on turn taking and facilitation and mutual support and mutual respect. But with able-bodied people, that's non-existent. Where is the care work? Often hearing people say things like, oh, I'm so sorry, Jon. I just can't understand your accent. It's too thick. There's no expectation that you would work with the individual to explore ways to communicate. I'm not even going to get into some of the racist parts that are embedded within that about an accent versus not a clear accent. So, I need to kind of speed up a little bit. I'm running out of time. One of the things that I'm learning about related to pragmatics is that there are these checklists. Through the Trump years, I was observing behavior. And during COVID, who could behave in an outlandish way? People showing up with no mask in a grocery store and walking proudly down the aisles. I'm looking at this. Ooh, oh, my cat's here. I'm so sorry. We have people coming into large meetings and saying things like, the Constitution says my kids need to breathe oxygen. That we've accepted that, but it's this checklist, focusing on this checklist. For me, these people, if I were to use a checklist, these people have clear, pragmatic They're clear pragmatics. They do. But at the same time, for a deaf person to see that, it means they have been labeled and so they're labeled as delayed pragmatically. If a Black individual were to act up, they've probably got oppositional defiance disorder. Again, who has permission to act poorly? Who has permission to not, or the ability to not be good during discourse? Just because you have a disability, people seem ready to add all of these things. But a big oppressive thing in the classroom is that they are labeled and they are kept down via the classroom. I am going to go ahead and wrap up.
So again, where do we go? Many linguists know the meaning of co-construction. And I think we are starting to come back to an idea where dialogue is actually co-constructed. We don't just have a listener, and a speaker. We must accept that there are significant issues with the idea of a speaker and a listener. We know that pragmatics tends to be racist. It tends to be riddled with assumptions that disabled people don't know how to interact. And so what does that say about how we study pragmatics? What does that say about the notes that people are keeping, the way that they are observing us and classifying us? What does that mean for ASLI? If we are looking at the normative distribution and looking at those who exist on the outskirts as bad or less than, how can we flip the script? I've worked in a school of education, which means that people always want something done and they want it done right now. I have some ideas of practical things we can do. I think we need to emphasize the multimodality of language. Language is multimodal: spoken, tactile, signed, drawn, used through pictures. Regardless of the modality, language is language. Within the field of education, there is a lot of discussion about parent choice. And often what we call modality, oppression, and hierarchy. Sometimes we use the language of judgment to support parents' choice. We want to encourage the language of the home. We want them to behave well so they can make friends. And that means oralism, and that means speech therapy. And it is presented as disability rights, when in fact, with all of variation, if in fact variation is good, then why are only some? Well, it becomes complicated and we need to be careful. A lot of analysis now is focused on corpora or corpuses. The problem is that what other people can say it better than I can, so I will reference someone else. If the analysis is only written language, then tactile language is not represented. Signed language is not represented. Communication through pictures is not represented. We are limited to what is written in a book and what can be included within that context. And so sometimes we say, oh, we've studied 50 languages within this corpus, and so therefore all languages must have this same structure. And the answer is no. No. If that exists in that corpus, then fine, but you can't generalize it to all other language modalities. Sometimes we like to declare that we have discovered something. We're looking for attention. Look at me, look at what I have found. And in that, we are stepping over other people to gain the spotlight. Language is part of the body, and bodies are not perfect. If your data includes no disabled bodies, then you are not representing the population. You are maybe representing 25% of the population. If your corpus has no disability present, if you focus only on spoken language and you don't talk at all about a stutter or any kind of quote speech issues, then you're not actually being representative in your corpus. You have to take the time to explore and search out the disabled bodies that are using the language that you say you're studying. And I am speaking of spoken corpuses, but don't think I'm overlooking signed as well. We are working on that. And we are actively working to build that. Okay, I know that I have gone slightly over time. I am finally there. Are we ready for questions? This is Natasha. Wow, John, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We appreciate your time. We do have a few questions. And if any people have questions that they would like to continue to ask, please feel free. For this, I will be voicing the questions and I will have the interpreter sign them.
So our first question is from Amber Martin. And Amber says, thank you for your talk. Good stuff. I'm wondering how or if you conceptualize the concept of language deprivation within the framework of cryptlinguistics.
That's always one of the first questions that comes up. I think that language deprivation has negative effects, but I do not want to penalize adults who have been the recipient of language deprivation. I believe that there is a researcher who did a study in Bali on adults who were experienced severe language deprivation and the home signs that they use. And within themselves and their community, they actually had quite a rich form of communication. We need to start thinking about what we do and the people that use language and work to not increase the oppression that they are experiencing. When it comes to language deprivation, if I am a starving child and I am developing rickets and I have to use a wheelchair, the disability itself is not bad, but the act of starvation is bad. So when we talk about language deprivation, the disability is not bad. The act of depriving language is what is bad. So we have to consider that and really be careful with that distinction.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Does anybody have questions? Nobody? Nobody has any questions they want to ask? If we don't have any other questions, I want to let you know that we have a reception after this presentation.
But where's the food?
Right, right, I know, right?
Just trying
So
to be humorous.
it's more of a party after this presentation, and that will start about 5:45. You're all welcome to come. Please join at any time for socializing and more discussion with our presenter. But, oh, we do have another question that came in.
All right, so our next question is from Lena Hu, and Lena asks to Jon and his co-author Tavian, who is also attending this evening. Are you familiar with Nate Dumas, D-U-M-A-S, work on stuttering? I think his work would be perfect for your CRIP linguistics.
Octavian is actually working on CRIP speech at the moment. So Octavian would be more of the expert on that topic than I would be at this time. I'm focusing more on the pragmatic piece. But I'm sure Octavian would answer that question better than I could.
Okay, so now I don't think there are any other questions. So I put the link for the after party in the chat.
Sending love to everyone.
To see you
Thank
all
you for
there.
coming.
To really see everybody, maybe in about 15 minutes or so. All right, and thank you all.